Tantura, exposing a hidden massacre of 1948. On a tranquil Mediterranean shore in northern Israel, families picnic on Dor Beach as waves lap against the sand. Few realize that beneath the adjacent asphalt parking lot lie the untold secrets of a destroyed village, Al Tantura. Over 70 years ago, on the night of May 22nd to 23rd, 1948, this coastal Palestinian village was the scene of a mass killing whose traces were buried, both literally and figuratively, under decades of denial. Today, survivors' descendants and determined researchers are unearthing the truth in what has become a battle for historical memory and justice. This investigative feature chronicles the Tantura massacre, its timeline of events, the silenced testimonies of victims and perpetrators, the scholarly and legal struggles to document it, and the ongoing efforts to honor the village's erased history. It is at once a tribute to the victims and displaced and a reckoning with a past that refuses to remain buried. Background: war, Nakba, and a village targeted. In late 1947, as the British mandate over Palestine waned, the United Nations voted to partition the land into Jewish and Arab states. The village of Tantura, a small fishing and farming community of roughly 1,500 people south of Haifa, fell within the territory allotted to the future Jewish state. Tensions quickly erupted into conflict. By the spring of 1948, a period Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, catastrophe, for the mass displacement of their people, Jewish paramilitary forces, soon to become the Israeli Defense Forces, executed Plan Dalet, a military strategy to secure key areas. Under Plan Dalet, the Haganah's Alexandronini Brigade was explicitly assigned to occupy Tantura and the nearby village of Al-Furaidis. The coastal location of Tantura, with its small port and access to maritime routes, made it strategically significant. As Ehsan Aymar, whose family hails from Tantura, explains, Tantura was not an ordinary village. It had a small port, commerce, and agriculture. That is why it was a target for the Israeli forces, who feared it would be a point for smuggling weapons from Lebanon. The village's size, larger than neighboring communities, and its residents' resistance to encroaching forces had marked it for conquest. By mid-May 1948, the State of Israel had been declared, and open war raged between the new state and neighboring Arab armies. Amid this chaos, dozens of Palestinian villages were being depopulated, some peacefully, many by force. Tantura's turn came just 1 week after Israel's independence. The events that unfolded there would long remain shrouded in fear and suppression, emblematic of the broader Nakba in which over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled from their homes. What follows is a timeline of Tantura's fate and its aftermath, situating a single village's tragedy within the larger cataclysm of 1948. Timeline of the Tantura massacre and aftermath. 22nd to 23rd May 1948, Battle and Surrender of Tantura. The Haganah's Alexandroni Brigade, 33rd Battalion, attacks Tantura overnight. After fierce fighting, the village surrenders. In the aftermath, Israeli soldiers begin executing Palestinian prisoners and non-combatants. Witnesses later report seeing groups of unarmed men led away and shots ringing out, indicating summary executions. An estimated dozens to over 200 villagers are killed. 23rd May 1948, morning. Roundup and mass burial. At dawn, surviving villagers are rounded up, women and children separated from the men. Israeli troops compel Palestinian laborers to load bodies onto carts and dispose of them in pits. One child witness, Muhammad Abu Hana, recalls seeing bodies piled on a cart and dumped into a big pit near the railroad tracks. Late May 1948. Expulsion of survivors. In the days following the massacre, the remaining women, children, and elderly of Tantura are expelled under guard. Under the supervision of the Red Cross, they are forced to march or transported to the nearby Arab village of Furaides. Many men of fighting age are sent to prison camps. Some are later transferred out of the nascent state in prisoner exchanges. Dozens of Tantura's young men simply disappeared, presumed executed or imprisoned. 13. June 1948. Colonization of Tantura's lands. A mere 3 weeks after the village's fall, a group of Zionist settlers establishes Kibbutz Nasholim on Tantura's lands. In the following months and years, Tantura's hundreds of stone houses are systematically demolished or repurposed. Stones from Palestinian homes are used to construct new buildings in Nasholim and another adjacent Jewish community, literally building the new atop the ruins of the old. Tantura, as a populated village, ceases to exist, its name erased from maps and its lands absorbed into Israel. 1951. First public account, Nimr al-Khatib, a Palestinian author, publishes one of the first written accounts of the Tantura massacre, documenting evidence of systematic shootings and a communal grave. His early testimony, like many others from Palestinians, is largely ignored or dismissed in Israeli public discourse. 1961. Academic acknowledgement. Historian Walid Khalidi referenced Tantura in an academic study, noting the methodical shooting and burial in a communal grave of some 40 young men from the village. This brief mention in scholarly work keeps the memory alive in historical records, even as official Israeli narratives continue to omit such events. 1998. The Katz Master's Thesis, Theodore Teddy. Katz, a graduate student at Haifa University, submits a master's thesis based on 140 hours of oral interviews about Tantura. Katz's research, involving 135 witnesses, both Jewish veterans and Arab survivors, concludes that a large-scale massacre of surrendered villagers occurred in Tantura. His thesis initially earns high marks, quietly affirming what Palestinian memory had long alleged. January 2000. Exposure and backlash. An Israeli journalist, Amir Gilat, publishes an article in Ma'arif newspaper drawing on Katz's findings, bringing the Tantura massacre to public attention. Outraged Alexandroni Brigade veterans lodge fierce denials. They sue Katz for libel, demanding retraction. Under intense pressure during the trial, Katz signs a statement retracting his massacre claims, a move he soon regrets. The court accepts the retraction and closes the case without ever reviewing Katz's tapes. Haifa University, bowing to controversy, suspends Katz's degree and requires revisions. A re-examination process results in his thesis being disqualified as non-research. The massacre narrative is officially buried once more, even as debates smolder in academic and journalistic circles. 2004. Historical unease. Prominent Israeli historian Benny Morris publishes a review of the Katz affair and the evidence. Morris expresses a deep sense of unease, acknowledging that war crimes undeniably occurred at Tantura, even if the full extent of the killing remains disputed. He notes indications that Alexandroni soldiers likely executed prisoners of war and committed looting, citing an IDF report that euphemistically referred to unspecified sabotage, Kabbalah, in the village. Morris points out a striking pattern. All Palestinian refugees he interviewed affirmed a massacre, while all Jewish veterans denied it, a divide he finds deeply telling. Still, Israeli society by and large remains reluctant to revisit 1948 atrocities. 2008, Diaspora Voices, Over Their Dead Bodies. Lebanese-Palestinian filmmaker Arab Lutfi releases a documentary titled Over Their Dead Bodies, featuring testimonies of Tantura survivors in exile. In one scene, An elderly survivor points to a spot by a stone wall in Tantura and says, "Here they buried the men and old women after they died," indicating a mass grave location. Such accounts, circulating mostly in the Arab world, keep the memory of Tantura alive among Palestinians, even as the subject remains sensitive in Israel. January 2022. Documentary revelation: Israeli filmmaker Alon Schwartz premieres Tantura at the Sundance Film Festival. This hard hitting documentary brings to the screen the voices of Alexandroni Brigade veterans themselves, now in their 90s, some of whom confess on camera that unarmed Arab villagers were killed after Tantura's surrender. Different ex soldiers give varying estimates of the death toll, from a few to dozens, to more than 200. The latter from a Zikron Yaakov resident who helped bury bodies. They confirm that a mass grave was dug, precisely where Dor Beach parking lot now lies. Other veterans on film still vehemently deny a massacre, illustrating the enduring divide. The film shocks Israeli audiences and prompts calls, including from Haaretz's editorial board and the Palestinian Authority, to finally investigate the site and acknowledge the truth. May 2023. Forensic investigation. Independent researchers from forensic architecture based at Goldsmiths, University of London, commissioned by the Palestinian NGO Adala, release a detailed report mapping Tantura's mass graves. Using 3D modeling, historical aerial photos, and combined eyewitness testimonies, they identify 3 likely burial sites beneath the modern beach resort area. 2 large rectangular earth mounds, one 33 meters long, another 19 meters, are detected under Dokar Beach's car park, consistent with graves potentially holding on the order of 70 to 140 bodies and 40 to 80 bodies, respectively. A third site, near the remnants of a village courtyard wall, is also flagged as a possible execution and burial site. Their conclusion: the victims of 1948 are still there under the soil, and there's no visual evidence of any later exhumation. Armed with technology and truth, the long-silenced dead of Tantura begin to speak once more. By morning, the shooting had stopped. The massacre unfolds. A British survey map from 1942 shows Tantura's layout on the Carmel coast. In 1948, the village's location made it a strategic target. It lay along the coastal road and had a small harbor. Within 6 years of this map, Tantura would be erased from it. In the dark hours of May 22, 1948, as battle raged, many Tantura villagers sought shelter or attempted to flee. Haganah forces encircled the area, advancing with mortar fire from land and even naval support from sea, according to later recollections. By the early hours of May 23rd, the village defenses collapsed. Tantura surrendered. What happened next scarred the memory of those who lived through it. Survivor testimonies describe how the victorious Israeli troops separated the unarmed inhabitants. Women and children were gathered in one spot, while all men, including youths and the elderly, were taken aside. Muhammad Abu Hana, then a child, later recounted the terror of that morning. The attackers rounded everyone up, women and children on one side, the men on the other. Soldiers led groups of men away, and you could hear gunfire after each departure. Each burst of gunfire meant another group of fathers, sons, brothers did not return. When the sun rose higher, the villagers saw the grisly evidence of what had occurred under cover of darkness. I saw bodies piled on a cart pulled by men of Tantura, Abu Hana remembered, who emptied their cargo in a big pit. Corpses lay scattered on the ground by the road and near the old railroad tracks. The conquerors forced surviving Palestinian villagers to dig mass graves. Some of the defeated were made to become grave diggers for their own community. Later, one veteran of the Alexandroni Brigade would admit that Our boys know the craft of murder quite well, especially those seeking revenge for Jewish losses. A chilling hint from a contemporary diary that personal vengeance played a role in the slaughter. There is no complete record of how many were killed in those hours. Estimates vary widely, in part because most eyewitnesses were silenced or scattered. Palestinian accounts collected over the years suggest at least on the order of 100 plus fatalities. The official death toll of Tantura's battle in Israeli archives was put at 70, including combatants. But that number is now widely seen as a gross undercount. Even Israeli researcher Alon Schwartz, after listening to all the recorded interviews, concluded that between 200 and 250 Palestinian men were systematically executed after the village's surrender. In one testimony unearthed by Schwartz, a Jewish resident of nearby Zichron Yaakov, who assisted with burials, stated plainly that over 200 bodies were interred. On the other hand, another veteran claimed only a few were killed. The truth may lie somewhere in between, but clearly a massacre, not just heat of battle crossfire, took place. As historian Benny Morris wrote, even if one debates the exact body count, there was no doubt that war crimes were committed by the Jewish forces and that the village was forcibly cleansed of its Arab inhabitants. Amid the carnage, a peculiar intervention occurred. Yaakov Epstein, the Mukhtar, headman of the neighboring Jewish town Zichron Yaakov, rushed to Tantura when he learned his friends were in danger. Epstein reportedly confronted the soldiers amid the killings. Gaudat Hindi, daughter of Tantura's own Mukhtar, recalled that Epstein was crying, saying that we did not expect such a day and such a happening to our neighbors. By some accounts, Epstein's pleas managed to halt further executions, but only after scores were already dead. He came too late, one survivor said bitterly of the belated rescuer. Still, this episode stands as evidence that not all local Jews condoned the massacre. There were contemporaries horrified by what was unfolding. Aftermath: displacement, erasure, and silence. When the gunfire subsided, the ordeal of Tantura's people did not end. It merely entered a new phase. Israeli officers ordered the surviving women, children, and elderly to leave their homes for good. Under armed watch, hundreds of traumatized villagers were herded north along the coastline to Furaidis, the nearest Arab village that had not been emptied. Photographs from June 1948 show lines of Tantura's women and children being escorted by Red Cross officials, carrying what few belongings they could muster. From Furaidis, many were soon expelled across armistice lines into the West Bank or into Lebanon and Jordan. Some spent time in British-run or Israeli-run prison camps before being released or exchanged. A number of Tantura's young men ended up in Syria's Yarmouk refugee camp, never to see their homeland again. My grandmother ended up in Furaidis, Ehsan Aymar recounted of his family's dispersal. But many of our family members became refugees in the neighboring Arab countries and the West Bank. For a small fraction, there was a bittersweet reprieve. A few Tantura families managed to remain inside Israel's borders, mainly by resettling in Furaidis or the Arab town of Jisr al-Zarqa down the coast. Kamal Masri, born a decade after the massacre to a Tantura family, estimates about 1,200 Tantura villagers initially fled to Furaidis for refuge, but most of them were persecuted by the Israeli forces. Only some remained there long term. One of those who stayed was Masri's own grandfather, who survived the killing and helped bury the dead. According to Masri, his grandfather told of being forced at gunpoint to dig graves and bury approximately 150 bodies, a figure that stunned his descendants. Not only is the parking lot over graves, Masri's grandfather would insist, but there are several more mass graves around the village site. Women, children, and elderly from Tantura were expelled under guard in June 1948, watched by UN observers and Red Cross personnel. Israeli soldiers provided water and aid for the cameras, even as families were permanently uprooted from their homes. In the weeks after occupation, Tantura's physical eradication began. The once thriving coastal village, with its mosque, school, and tightly clustered stone houses amid orchards, was systematically wiped off the map. On June 13, 1948, new Jewish immigrants and Israeli soldiers moved onto the land, establishing Kibbutz Nasholim on Tantura's beach front. One contemporary observer described how, in the 12 following months, the very stones from the village houses were scavenged as construction material for the kibbutz, and a second community built over Tantura's ruins. In other words, the village was literally used to build its replacement. By the 1950s, little remained of Tantura but rubble. Even the name Tantura was wiped from official maps, replaced by Nasholim, or the Hebrew Dor, after a nearby archaeological mound. 500-plus Palestinian villages met similar fates in 1948, but Tantura's destruction was particularly thorough. As historian Walid Khalidi wrote, these locales were not only depopulated, their very names were removed from contemporary Israeli maps, a bit to erase their memory. The survivors of Tantura, scattered and scarred, learned quickly that speaking of what had happened could invite retribution. Within Israel, military censorship and fear of the security services, the Shin Bet, stifled open discussion. "We never dared to talk about the massacre in public," recalls Ehsan Aymar, whose father and uncle lived through the events. "We were always afraid of the police and the Shin Bet. We inherited this fear from the people who witnessed the massacre, who were exposed to threats and attempts at intimidation. Over time, silence became a survival mechanism. Parents passed on knowledge of Tantura's last days to their children in whispers at home, but rarely outside. For many Israelis, meanwhile, Tantura became just another abandoned Arab village, its dark history unmentioned in textbooks and collective memory. Yet, even as official narratives tried to bury the truth, fragments persisted. Palestinian historians and writers in exile documented the Nakba's atrocities, including Tantura, based on eyewitnesses. By 1961, Walid Khalidi's research had noted Tantura's massacre, and crucially, in the late 1990s, a breakthrough came from within Israel's own academia, a development that would blow open the controversy and pit truth against power. The Katz thesis, when history challenged the narrative. In 1998, Theodor Teddy Katz, a 50-year-old Israeli graduate student at the University of Haifa, submitted an explosive master's thesis. Katz had spent countless hours traveling to meet aging 1948 veterans and Palestinian survivors, some inside Israel, others in the West Bank and Gaza, to record their testimonies. All told, he gathered 140 hours of taped interviews with 135 witnesses, half of them Jewish, mostly Alexandroni Brigade members, half of them Arab, former residents of Tantura. This wealth of oral history formed the backbone of his thesis, which concluded that a massacre had indeed been perpetrated by Alexandroni troops after Tantura's fall. Katz's work, titled The Alexandroni Brigade and the Occupation of Tantura Village, quietly received a grade of 97%, an academic affirmation that the events long denied had basis in fact. For 2 years, Katz's research remained largely unnoticed outside scholarly circles. But in January 2000, a reporter for Ma'ariv newspaper unearthed the story. Headlines blared allegations of an Israeli massacre in 1948, shattering a taboo. The reaction from the veteran community was swift and furious. Survivors of the Alexandroni Brigade's 33rd Battalion, now men in their 70s and 80s, closed ranks to protect their legacy. They vehemently denied Katz's findings and filed a defamation suit against him, demanding over 1 million shekels in damages. The trial that followed was extraordinary. History itself seemed to go on the stand. In court, Katz's defense was that he had faithfully recorded what the witnesses, including Israeli soldiers, told him. But facing a battery of aging veterans who insisted no massacre occurred, Katz found himself isolated. The judge did not listen to the actual tapes. After 2 days of relentless cross-examination, Katz, exhausted and under pressure, agreed to an out-of-court settlement. He signed a statement retracting his own thesis conclusions, effectively nullifying his claim that unarmed villagers were deliberately killed. The next day, Katz recanted his retraction, saying he had signed it in a moment of weakness that did not represent what he really felt about his findings. But it was too late. The judge refused to reopen the case, citing the sanctity of the signed settlement. In the end, Katz was left vindicated by evidence but defeated in court. Haifa University proceeded to strip Katz of his degree pending a revision of his thesis. The revised paper was submitted to a panel of examiners, some of whom, it later emerged, had vested interests. 2 had co-authored an official history justifying IDF actions. Katz's work was failed by a narrow vote, and he was granted only a non-research degree, a bureaucratic way to discredit his conclusions. To many observers, it appeared that institutional Israel was doubling down. The narrative of 1948 would not be rewritten without a fight. However, Katz's effort was not in vain. He had cracked open a door, and some prominent voices stepped through it. Ilan Pape, a historian at Haifa University and one of the so-called new historians, supported Katz unwaveringly. Pape published an article in 2001 defending Katz and the use of oral history to uncover what official archives omit. Crucially, Pape cited newly found archival evidence that corroborated Katz's interviews. One chilling document from the IDF's own files dated June 9, 1948, just weeks after Tantura's conquest, reports, "Yesterday I checked the mass grave in Tantura cemetery, found everything in order." This terse line, presumably from an Israeli officer to his commander, is virtually a smoking gun. It acknowledges a mass grave and implies an attempt to tidy up the scene of the crime. Pape also pointed to testimonies gathered from Tantura refugees in Syria, beyond Katz's scope, that further substantiated the massacre. To skeptics of Katz's work who dismissed Arab testimony as biased, Pape noted that Katz had also recorded Jewish soldiers describing the killings. In the public arena, the Katz affair became a cause célèbre. While Israeli academia largely shunned him, international scholars and media took interest. The narrative of Tantura started to seep into mainstream consciousness as one more dark chapter of the 1948 war. Benny Morris, who had initially been critical of Katz's methodology, revisited the case in a lengthy 2004 historical review. He confessed it left him deeply uneasy and concluded that although whether a massacre happened might be debated, certainly atrocities and an ethnic cleansing of the village happened. Morris even quoted an Alexandroni veteran's diary that spoke of soldiers taking private revenge and knowing the craft of murder, which Morris regarded as troubling hints of what transpired. These admissions from an establishment historian were significant, essentially breaking the wall of denial, if only partway. Still, inside Israel, many preferred to believe the veteran's version that any killing at Tantura was done in battle, not in cold blood. Nakba denial, the refusal to acknowledge the expulsions and massacres of Palestinians in 1948, held firm in the Israeli mainstream. The narrative only really began shifting generations later, helped by new voices and new evidence. Breaking this silence, veterans' testimonies and documentary exposé. The year 2022 marked a turning point in the public discourse on Tantura. That January, filmmaker Alon Schwartz released Tantura, a documentary that landed like a moral grenade in Israeli society. Schwartz, an Israeli director, had heard of the Katz controversy and decided to seek out the original evidence for himself. He painstakingly digitized all 140 hours of Katz's interview tapes. Then he tracked down surviving Alexandroni Brigade veterans willing to go on camera, as well as Palestinian survivors and experts like Ilan Pape. The resulting film, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and later aired on Israeli TV, confronted viewers with the voices and faces of those directly involved in 1948. Several of the now elderly Israeli veterans made startling admissions. One after another, they haltingly confirmed key elements of the mythical massacre. Yes, unarmed men were shot dead after the battle, they said. Not in crossfire, but in organized fashion. One veteran described men being killed in groups, another recalled seeing bodies. Importantly, a man from nearby Zikron Yaakov recounted that he had been brought in to help dig a mass grave for over 200 corpses. That testimony put to rest any notion that only dozens might have died. If accurate, it meant a massacre on a huge scale. On the other hand, Schwartz's interviews also included veterans who stuck to the old denial script, some becoming visibly agitated or evasive on camera. The film juxtaposed these contradictory accounts, but the weight of evidence clearly tipped toward confirming a war crime had taken place. Crucially, Schwartz's documentary didn't rely on oral testimony alone. It buttressed these recollections with hard evidence. Historical aerial photographs of Tantura from mid-1948 were analyzed by independent experts, including some within the Israeli military who chose to remain anonymous. They identified disturbed earth, consistent with a large burial pit, near the village's Muslim cemetery and by the beach, exactly where survivors had long said a mass grave was dug. Schwartz also obtained declassified IDF documents, like the mass grave in order memo Pape had cited, and presented them to viewers. One striking scene in the film shows Judge Drora Pilpil, the very judge who oversaw Katz's libel case, listening to the taped testimonies of soldiers describing killing civilians. The now retired judge's eyes widen as she murmurs, "This I never heard. If it's true, it is a shame. If Katz had such things, he should have seen it through." Her reaction was a tacit acknowledgement that Katz had been right and that the truth had been suppressed in her courtroom decades earlier. The impact of Tantura in Israel was profound. For many younger Israelis, it was the first time they were confronted with their country's founders committing an atrocity against Palestinians, not as a fringe accusation, but through the words of the very soldiers involved. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz ran an editorial calling for an official inquiry and urging the government to clean the skeletons in the closet, to excavate the Dor Beach parking lot for remains. The Palestinian Authority, in turn, renewed its call for an international commission to investigate not just Tantura, but all 1948 massacres. On social media, the revelations prompted a wave of discussion, with Palestinians pointing out that their own historians, like Walid Khalidi in All That Remains, had documented such events for years, only to be ignored until Israelis themselves admitted them. At this point, the only reason to believe the Israeli narrative of the Nakba over the Palestinian one is pure racism, one observer commented, noting it shouldn't require a perpetrator's confession for these stories to be believed. Not everyone welcomed the documentary's findings. Some Israeli academics doubled down on criticism of Katz and Schwartz. Yoav Gelber, a historian who had led efforts to discredit Katz's thesis, appears in the film dismissing it due to a supposed paucity of documentation beyond oral testimonies. Gelber and even Benny Morris argued that without written orders or extensive archival records explicitly describing a massacre, the case was still unproven. A stance critics say ignores how war crimes were often deliberately unrecorded. One veteran interviewed by Schwartz, who had admitted off camera that a massacre happened, told the New York Times that the soldiers acted on their own without orders, perhaps an attempt to shield higher ups like the brigade commanders or political leaders from blame. The culture of denial has eroded but not vanished. Nonetheless, the documentary clearly shifted the needle of public opinion towards acknowledgement. For the people of Tantura, those in Israel and the diaspora, Schwartz's film was a catharsis. If an Israeli director talks about the issue, what prevents us, the owners of the place, from talking? Reflected Ehsan Aymar, describing how the documentary shattered the barrier of fear that had long kept survivors quiet. After the film aired, descendants of Tantura's refugees formed a People's Committee to monitor the issue of the mass graves in Tantura. They began openly demanding that Israeli authorities finally recognize what happened on that beach in 1948. Their asks were simple and humane. Fence off the mass grave areas, no longer use them as a parking lot, and permit a memorial to be placed for Tantura's martyrs. We will continue to fight for the memory of Tantura and for our lands, vowed Aymar, whose own uncle was killed there. Unearthing the graves, science and memory converge. In mid-2023, that fight took a high-tech turn. Commissioned by the Adala Legal Center, researchers from forensic architecture applied advanced forensic and cartographic techniques to the Tantura case, effectively fusing science with oral history to pinpoint where the victims lie. Their investigation combed through aerial photographs from the 1940s and 1950s, correlated them with witness sketches, and even employed ground-penetrating analyses of the terrain. The result was a 70-page report that identified 3 primary locations of interest. Mass Grave E1, a rectangular earth mound about 33 meters long by 3 meters wide, roughly parallel to the old Tantura cemetery. This feature, now beneath a section of the Door Beach parking area, aligns with testimonies describing a large pit for bodies. Forensic architecture estimates on the order of 70 to 140 bodies could be buried in this grave alone. Mass Grave E2, a second elongated mound that's 19 meters by 3 meters, located closer to the village's former center. This too sits under what is currently a tourist parking lot. It likely contains approximately 40 to 80 bodies, according to the investigators' calculations of volume and witness reports. Notably, both E1 and E2 share a similar orientation and shape, suggesting a common method of digging and filling, consistent with hasty mass burials in May 1948. The wall grave, several witnesses over the decades, Palestinian survivors and even one Israeli, spoke of an execution site by a stone wall near the beach. Forensic architecture pinpointed a spot behind the house of a man named Ahmad Haj Yahya as it stood in 1948, where a courtyard wall existed. A survivor, Mustafa al-Masri, in a 2008 interview stood at that wall and said, "Here they buried the men and old women." Interestingly, in later years, bones were reportedly found at that very location. The team observed ground disturbances on historical imagery consistent with a burial there. This suggests a third mass grave, possibly containing those executed on the spot by the wall, separate from those in the big pit. The forensic architecture report concluded that it is unlikely that the bodies were later exhumed from any of these sites, as aerial photos up to October 1949 show no sign of digging up the graves. In other words, the remains of Tantura's dead almost certainly still lie where they were buried in 1948. Modern beachgoers have been parking their cars atop a graveyard. These findings bring a measure of tangible closure to what was often dismissed as hearsay. It's one thing to hear survivors say, "There are at least 3 mass graves," as Aymar did, but it's another to see it mapped out in satellite images and 3D models. The Israeli government has yet to act on this information. No excavation or official forensic exhumation has occurred. but the evidence is now preserved in digital form, accessible to the world. Memory, justice, and the struggle for recognition. For the descendants of Tantura, pursuing recognition of the massacre is not about rekindling old animosities. It's about historical justice and dignity for their ancestors. In 2015, Palestinian citizens of Israel, including many from Tantura families, held a march of return to Tantura's lands for the first time. Waving Palestinian flags and carrying signs with the names of the dead, they walked the grounds of the vanished village, affirming that someone remembers. This has since become an annual pilgrimage, interrupted only by the pandemic. You cannot separate a person from their history and the historical truth, says Kamal Masri. Israelis must understand this. For Masri and his peers, many of whom are third generation survivors, breaking the silence is a form of healing and resistance. It is telling that younger Palestinians, the grandchildren of the Nakba, are leading this charge. As one local activist observed, the third generation is more able to talk about the facts and history after decades of enforced amnesia. Indeed, across the Palestinian diaspora, there is a growing movement, some dub it part of an Arabcore cultural resurgence, to reclaim stories of 1948 through art, music, and social media, ensuring that names like Tantura enter global consciousness alongside Deir Yassin or Liditz or Oradour. The narrative of Tantura is no longer confined to furtive family stories or obscure archives. It has become a symbol, a microcosm of the entire Nakba. As Middle East scholar Salman Abu Sitta once said, Tantura represents a microcosm of the whole story of Palestine, encapsulating in one village the processes of ethnic cleansing, memory erasure, and the refusal of a people to forget. The push to acknowledge what happened at Tantura is intertwined with the broader campaign for recognition of the Nakba. It challenges Israel to look honestly at the darker aspects of its founding, not to undermine its legitimacy, but to enable a more truthful coexistence. So far, Israeli officialdom has not issued an apology or memorial for Tantura's victims, but there are signs of change. In early 2022, when the documentary made waves, even some Israeli commentators conceded that a state confident in its history should not fear the truth. The editorial board of Haaretz argued that investigating Tantura was a moral imperative, asking what harm could come from knowing where dozens of people are buried and giving their families closure. The Nakba, long a forbidden word in Israeli discourse, is increasingly discussed in mainstream forums, no longer only whispered by Palestinian citizens. Young Jewish Israeli activists, too, have begun attending Nakba memorial events, signaling a generational shift in empathy. For the people of Tantura, justice is not only about uncovering bones, it is about restoring dignity. They seek to mark the ground so that visitors know this is hallowed earth soaked in blood, not just a picnic spot. We demand to fence off the area of the mass graves and to place a monument to commemorate Tantura's martyrs, states the People's Committee in its manifesto. These demands echo other belated recognitions of historical crimes worldwide, from plaques at massacre sites to memorial gardens at former villages. In a way, the Arab villagers of Tantura, many now living a stone's throw away in Furaidis or across the ocean in exile, are asking for something very simple: to acknowledge that their ancestors lived and unjustly died on that beautiful shore. Scholars like Ilan Pape and Walid Khalidi frame Tantura in the context of memory against forgetting. By documenting each destroyed village, by interviewing each survivor before they pass on, they build an archive that defies the intended erasure. In Pape's words, 1948 was nothing less than the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, a term that earned him vilification at home, but which he and many others insist is the proper name for the process that engulfed Tantura and over 400 other villages. Benny Morris, who once balked at the phrase, later acknowledged that yes, a form of ethnic cleansing did occur. He just argued it was a tragic necessity of nation building. But necessity or not, the facts of those expulsions and massacres are gradually entering Israeli historical scholarship, thanks in no small part to the perseverance of those who refused to let Tantura be forgotten. In tribute to the people of Tantura, one might envision the following. A visitor to Dor Beach in the near future finds not an anonymous parking lot, but a modest memorial. Perhaps a plaque or statue stands under the palm trees, inscribed in Arabic, Hebrew, and English. It might read, in memory of the villagers of Al Tantura, who on 22nd to 23rd May 1948 were killed or expelled from their homes, may their story be remembered, and may peace prevail on this shore. Such an act of remembrance would not restore the destroyed village, nor bring back the dead, but it would heal something in the living, a recognition that even the darkest chapters of history can be faced with honesty and compassion. The Tantura massacre can no longer be consigned to the shadows. Survivors and even perpetrators have broken the silence. Forensic science has lent its weight. The village that was wiped off the map has found a place in the historical record. In the words of Sami Al-Ali, a member of Tantura's Heritage Committee, the massacre took place after the battle ended, as revenge. They even tried to hide the crime with PR photos of soldiers giving water to Tantura's people. But the truth, he notes, will continue to haunt those who attempt to suppress it. Now that the ghosts of Tantura have been named, they will not be silenced again. This expose, aligned in spirit with the growing Arab cultural renaissance that insists on telling its own stories, stands as a testament and a tribute. A testament to the relentless pursuit of truth by journalists, historians, and ordinary people, and a tribute to the villagers of Tantura, those who died, those who survived in exile, and those who for generations have carried the memory of a hometown lost but never forgotten. If this story spoke to you, share it with your friends and communities. Arabcore is more than music. It's a movement rooted in memory and resistance. Follow us on social media, subscribe, and stay connected. Check out our YouTube and shop for merch at arabcore.shop. Your support helps keep our stories alive. Thanks for listening.